Planning and liberty. Everybody, or almost everybody, is convinced today of the effectiveness of the two techniques of intervention, norm and plan. And, in fact, in view of the challenges which not only nations but political and social systems hurl at one another, and even more in view of the challenge that man is making to misery, distress, and hunger, it is difficult to see how the use of the means provided by planning could be avoided. In the complexity of economic phenomena arising from techniques, how could one justify refusal to employ a trenchant weapon that simplifies and resolves all contradictions, orders incoherences, and rationalizes the excess of production and consumption? And since the techniques of economic observation, if they are to have their full scope, issue directly in the technique of planning, and since there can be no question of renouncing the youthful vigor of these mathematical methods, how is it possible not to see them through to the end? Yet, wow, there's a huge footnote here. Yet a certain disquiet has appeared among those who cherish human freedom and democracy. They ask if planning is not an all-consuming force. They seek to set three kinds of limits to its power, represented by A. Flexible planning, B. The system of limited planning, and C. The separation of the planning agency from the state. In short, what is usually called the reconciliation of liberty and socialism. No one accepts Friedrich August von Hayek's proposition in his Road to Serfdom that planning is essentially evil. Conscientious economists are unable to renounce technical discovery. They seek a middle term. This where this footnote is. I don't know if I want to read this. Okay, whatever. I suppose I should. This is massive, though. See a compendium of ideological illusions concerning planning and liberty contained in a recent special number devoted to this question in the Indian Journal of Political Science. 10 or so articles attempt to demonstrate that planning is indeed indispensable, but that it presents no danger at all to freedom. A complete unreality characterizes these articles. The position of the authors can be summarized as follows. First, they express the hope of saving freedom through liberal and partial planning. However, other authors in the same volume show that this hope is absurd and ineffective. Second, the articles contain other formulas, equally absurd and without content. Planning should have as its object the realization of freedom. The more rational planning becomes, the greater the freedom of the people. These are mere affirmations, and one would seek in vain for corresponding realities or for possible content. Some of these authors rely for proof of their propositions on a series of simple syllogisms. For example, 1. Planning increases production. 2. Production allows the satisfaction of more needs. 3. The satisfaction of needs is the condition of freedom. Hence, planning is the condition of freedom. This reasoning is faulty for two reasons. It is linear and takes no account of the complexity of the facts. For example, put a man in prison, give him everything he needs, he is nonetheless free. It derives its conclusion partly from an economic premise, the first, and partly from an ethical premise, the third, without attempting to distinguish the logical planes on which these premises lie. The third premise is, in any case, wholly questionable from a spiritual or ethical point of view. I shall return later to a discussion of this. But for these authors, the principal hope of saving freedom in this amazing theory lies in the claim that an enlightened public opinion has the power to direct the decision of planners toward the satisfaction of its real needs. In this case, one would indeed have democratic planning, collectivism on a voluntary base. But to reason like this is surely to move in a world of dreams. The good faith of these intellectuals compels one to think seriously of pathology. Can anyone really believe that? If public opinion wanted pastry shops, planning could be oriented toward these institutions. If, in addition, the other uses of flour had to be sacrificed. Can anyone really believe that public opinion would receive any satisfaction if it demanded footgear when tractors were needed? Such beliefs are simple nonsense. It will be maintained that public opinion does not really know what it needs. But then the technician makes the decision. We are familiar enough with the mechanism. First, producer goods, then consumer goods. Of course, public opinion will be consulted after the technician has made his decision. You would have preferred woolen goods? Technically impossible. We had to make them of cotton. Green? Unfortunately, there is no aniline. But you can choose between light red and dark red. See what freedom you have? In effect, these authors seek to baptize obedience to technical necessity with the name freedom. They attempt to hide the real compulsions and write either out of blindness or hypocrisy. Only one of these articles is valid. Suda declares, "So much the worse for freedom, we can sacrifice it. In any case, on the plan of values, dedication to the common good is a higher ideal than freedom." I cannot agree with this, but at least it allows us honestly to assess our situation. We encounter the same attempt at justification, in general better supported by, but as unconvincing, in Entre la Plantification et la Liberté, in which Dutch, French, Norwegian, and American authors study the problem from very varied viewpoints. These illusions are contradicted by Tibor Mende himself. He shows that Indian agricultural planning, the communal projects of the villages, collapsed because it was not comprehensive and authoritarian. His comparison of India with China is a clear demonstration that, in accordance with the criteria of yield and efficiency, the sole justified criteria of any planning, the most authoritarian methods are the most profitable. Okay, they seek a middle term. Okay. Conscientious economists are unable to renounce technical discovery. They seek a middle term. Is it to be a limited plan? But then the problem is posed, where lies the limit? For some economists, planning is a purely economic question bearing on key industries. But the debate has lasted a century and no decision has been reached as to which industries are key industries. The decision becomes even more difficult as categories change with time. The extraction of uranium, for example, was not a key industry 20 years ago. And as the interpenetration of economic activity becomes greater and greater, it is becoming extremely difficult to analyze the factors involved in production. Every part of the system is, directly or indirectly, dependent on all the others through financial repercussions or through the structure of labor. How, then, is it possible to set up a planned sector of the economy alongside an unplanned sector? When one rereads what was published on this problem only 10 years ago, it is clear that these studies are completely out of date and have been rendered null and void by subsequent technical improvements. Let us assume that a plan has been made for a 5-year period. If now the attempt is made to limit it to economics by allowing the greatest possible freedom outside this area, for example, by having no planning in the social domain, how can this economic plan possibly be viable? The problem of financing is necessarily raised even by a flexible and limited plan. It was clear at the time of the discussion of the new phase of the Monnet Plan, September 1950, that bank credit, the appeal to private financing, was insufficient. It was necessary to turn to public financing. But this represented an enormous undertaking even for the state. The state was obliged to concern itself with the planning of its finances according to the more or less new totalitarian financial conception, which assumes control of the whole national revenue and affects every citizen. In order for the plan to be realized, the use of the labor force must also be integrated into it. This is recognized by Great Britain, for example, in its conception of full employment. The application of the plan likewise presupposes planning of housing and of vocational guidance, apprenticeships, and schools. Moreover, it quickly becomes clear that there is a need, too, for social security, a necessary psychological and sociological element in full employment is to function without too violent a shock to human nature. This interrelation is not imaginary and gratuitous. Internal necessity connects the elements of the plan, and it is folly to think of breaking its links. Thus, the plan, once adopted as method, tends perpetually to extend to new domains. To limit it would be to put the method in a position in which it cannot function, exactly as though one were to construct efficient automobiles, but refuse to build adequate roads. The car could indeed run on narrow, rutted, and sandy roads, but it would not give the results for which it had been designed. Certain complementary given elements become proportionately more numerous as planning improves and modern society becomes more complicated. These mutual relationships render limited planning impossible. The plan engenders itself unless technique itself is renounced. The plan engenders itself. That means the plan basically takes on a life of its own, I think. Or cause to give rise to a situation or condition. The plan engenders itself. So the plan gives rise to itself. It creates itself. So technique creates itself, makes itself more powerful, invades other domains. What's going on here? Why is it all fucked up? There we go. They probably are, Raiden. Hi, Erica. Why can't my eyes aren't working? Okay. The same situation holds if the planner aspires to adopt a flexible plan or one independent of the state. In such a case, the fundamentals of the plan are not obligatory. The plan appears as mere advice concerning what would be desirable. The producers remain independent. The the consumers have free choice, and the attitude of the individual prevails over the social. The flexible plan is subject to constant revisions and readjustments demanded by universal personal freedom. The same holds true if the attempt is made to refer the organization of the plan to agencies other than the state, to narrower organisms, such as administrative divisions of specialized economic organizations, or to organizations of wider scope, as for example, international organizations. The appeal to international bodies is designed to vitiate the criticism of such writers as Hayek concerning the dangers of totalitarianism which arise when the state is in charge of the plan. These different proposals are extremely deceptive. The flexible plan has only one defect. But that defect is crucial. The plan cannot be realized. The reason is simple. If the plan corresponds to the real nature of planning, it ought to fix objectives which normally would not be attained by the play of self-interest and of modicum of effort. It must stretch productive forces to the maximum, arouse energies, and exploit existing means with the maximum of efficiency. That planners do not always succeed, that administrative errors occur, and that not all planning invariably acts with the maximum efficiency is no more criticism of the system than errors of calculation are criticism of mathematics. But if the individual is allowed freedom of decision and there is no plan, he will not make the maximum effort required of him. If the industrialist is allowed to retain full independence, he will seek out other arrangements and not arrive at the objectives proposed. Hence, the plan, in order to be realized, must be paired with an apparatus of sanctions. This appears to be a veritable law of economics. Planning is inseparably bound up with coercion. The individual does not realize spontaneously what is most efficient, nor do the workers conform spontaneously to Gilbreth's movements. The following alternative presents itself. Either the plan is flexible and is not realized, as experience shows, in spite of the propaganda about the Monnet plan, its objectives were only 70% realized. The flexible plan of the Bulgarians in 1947 was 37% realized. The Monnet plan, which ought to have been completed in 1950, was actually completed in 1953, having taken twice the proposed time. In L'Action Psychologique, Maigret restudies the effect on the breakdown of the plan of the absence of propaganda, which would have rendered the plan psychologically compulsory. It is useless to expend the great amount of labor which goes into a plan only to reach a stalemate, or the plan must be realized, but at the cost of loading it with sanctions so that it becomes more rigid. Those who count on the good will of mankind display a delirious, idealistic optimism. Centuries of history, despite the facts, have not been able to convince them of the contrary. Reason certainly will not change them, but they are so far removed from reality that their opinion is negligible. The problem of sanctions brings planning into relation with the state. Anyone who claims that planning and the state are separable, or that local plans can be carried out, the TVA is always cited, has forgotten that local plans must be guaranteed by the state or they come to nothing. And this suffices to give back to the state all its prerogatives. It is evident, and Russia and Germany were no exceptions, that it is not the state itself which creates the plan, but rather some specialized organism more or less dependent on it. As to the TVA, the source of this enterprise was the Roosevelt government, which performed operations of expropriation, made means available, and assured sanctions. How, then, is it possible to retain a belief in the independence of the plan? The bond between planning and the state is organic and not due to chance. At the minimum, the power of the state is required for a general examination of available resources to put all the national forces to work. I do not use the word planning in the technical sense, as when one points to school construction programs or traffic signal installations. Local entities are of course able to execute such programs, but they do not represent planning any more than does dike construction in the Netherlands. If they did, the planning of a house by an architect would have to fall under this category. As to international decisions, which might be cited as a proof of the separation of the plan from the state, these do not represent plans in the proper sense of the term. For instance, the Bretton Woods agreements. The sole hope of realization of international plans, for example, in Europe, rests, as we clearly see today, on the existence of a European state. This kind of planning acquires substance only to the degree that such a state is constituted. This fact corroborates our thesis. Only a supranational state would be able to convince both the national states and the trusts to cooperate in a common economic operation. The Dawes and Young plans ended in failure because they had no means for genuine sanctions and no political power to support them. Conversely, we note that the Marshall Plan, which became the ECA, is imperceptibly producing a political system. The Atlantic Pact is a correlative to the Atlantic Pact is correlative. The Atlantic Pact is correlative to the Marshall Plan, and Europe will begin to organize itself only in the event that the ECA is seen to be completely useless unless it is applied to a politically ordered world. The Americans understood perfectly that the only alternative to a useless expenditure of money in the ECA was a European political organization. Unification, or even economic coordination, cannot be conceived of independently. Mere understanding or good intentions can scarcely result in real planning. Again, we are back at the necessary conditions for the realization of a planned economy. That in an ideal society, the connection between plan and state is unnecessary, just as the need for penalties disappears in the case of the individual as he exists in himself. I am willing to admit. But that does not make me believe in such an ideal and take it as a reality. In fact, I note that technique of knowledge engender and necessitate techniques of action, and techniques of action presuppose certain conditions and developments in accordance with a true law which might be called the law of the extension of planning. This extension of planning does not necessarily bring about a socialist society. Private ownership of the means of production need not be modified in order to have a planned economy. Likewise, planning does not necessarily bring about a dictatorial state. The use of sanctions and propaganda can be accommodated to forms other than dictatorships. But when a technique invades a certain domain in connection with planning, the technique affects its whole operation with completeness. It is useless to try to set limits to it or to seek some other mode of procedure. Nice. CC's trolls are evil.
What was that? What was all that?
The book, The Technological Society.
Let's see. Who's the author?
Jacques Ellul.
Is that for school?
No, he's a French professor. His name's Jacques Ellul, like Ellul.
But I mean, is it for school that you're studying? You're reading that?
Oh, no.
Just leisurely?
Yeah.
What's the what's the what's the main focus of it? I hear him talking about sanctions and political systems and things like this.
It's like a sociology book. It's called The Technological Society, so I guess it's like sort of about the impact of like technology and science on humanity, but he calls it technique. And to him, how does he define that? It's like
Technique and planning.
Well, I don't know. This shit's really complicated, man. A lot of it's going over my head.
Sounds like there's a lot of quite a bit of foundation that I would need to understand it.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to I'll probably never fully understand it.
Some things that like get clearer, like I don't know. It's like somebody gives you a box of Legos that builds a X-wing fighter. Say, oh, that's cool. I got all these pieces, and I can make parts of them out, and I can tell you this is the cockpit, this is the wing tip. It's like, but after a while, messing with it, you'll start putting pieces together. You're like, well, this attaches here, this goes there. And then eventually you'll grasp it. You'll have like the whole fighter put together. At least that's kind of my experience with things.
He says, in our technological society, technique is the totality of methods rationally arrived at and having absolute efficiency for a given stage of human development in every field of human activity. So it's like this it's this idea that there's like the most efficient way to do something, I guess. And so like our society is based on this criteria of efficiency rather than humanity. And he says this like concept of technique, it like kind of takes on a life of its own. And then like originally we kind of like created it to help us have easier lives, but in the end it's gonna enslave us, and like we're gonna be subject to technique, basically. That's what I think the book's about.
Interesting theory, I guess. Well, was at the end of the chapter.
Just like no, the chapters are crazy long. That was just like the end of a sub-chapter, I guess.
Okay.
I read for like 20 minutes.
It's lots to digest. Probably driving down the road is not the best time to try to do it.
It's good to. I'd like to just practice reading out loud, I guess.
Yeah. When I had a pretty long book that I wanted to read or to really learn, like I took the time to record myself reading one chapter just all the way through without really bothering to stop and think too much about it. Just reading the chapter through and recorded it, and like listen to the recording on the way to work.
The author is a Protestant, by the way.
That's interesting.
I'm not gonna say
what's tell. I wouldn't much be telling me, but it's interesting.
Yeah, he's my favorite Christian. That's why I kind of like he inspired me to become a Christian, really. go talk to my friend Johnny. I'll talk to you
Yeah.
later.
It's fucking frozen, bro. You know,
Man,
your
I could
testicles,
I
they will
could
stop
stand the
working.
cold. Yeah.
Are you a Christian?
Yo, Johnny.
What's up, Bart?
Johnny's
Yo, what's up?
sleeping there.
Yeah, P Mars, watch this video.
Did you post it somewhere? Oh. I don't know if I can watch it.
There's
I can't watch
a
this.
supermassive black hole at the center of every galaxy.
Yeah.
But
we
there's
think-
also other black holes that aren't necessarily in the center of galaxies.
Yeah, so these little ones were little, you know,
Little.
they're a few times the mass of the sun, and they're from collapsed stars. So they are stars at the end of their life.
Yo, is that Mick
Very
West?
bigger than the sun, more massive than the sun. But they run out of their fuel and they start to collapse because gravity squashes them. And if they're sufficiently massive, then there's nothing that can stop the collapse. And so they collapse, as far as we know, to a point, right? Essentially an infinitely dense point. We don't really know what happens we don't know what happens right in the middle. But they collapse to such an extent that there's a region around it from which light can't escape. And so nothing can escape. And that's a black hole.
And what happens to them? Do they travel? Are they moving through space?
Yeah, they're still stars,
Right.
you know. So they're still there. They're surrounded this region where if you fall in, it's called the event horizon. And if you go across that horizon, then you are going to the center. There's one way of thinking about it, which is quite cool, which is that the time and space sort of flip is one way to think about it. So in the same way that we are going into the future now. So we're going to tomorrow. There's nothing we can do about it. We are going to tomorrow. In the same way, if you fall in across the event horizon of a black hole, you are going to the middle, the singularity it's called. So that's your future. Every line of your future points to the center of the ultimate of no escape, the ultimate prison. You're going to get squashed to an infinitely dense
So
point.
not
basically.
every star becomes a black hole at the end of its life?
No, because if
Oh,
something like the
shit.
sun,
We have a
Then-
small...
it's quite small, yeah. And when it collapses, there's a sort of a pressure, a force, if you like, which is caused by the fact that electrons don't like to be. very
You
close
sound
to
like
each
you're
other.
talking from
So
a
it's called the
space
Pauli
station, bro.
exclusion principle.
Your mic.
essentially what
Do you
happens
use
is,
this sound
so there's
effect
the-
or it's just your mic?
Get squashed closer and closer together. They move faster and faster to sort of get out of each other's way, if you like, and that makes a force which holds them up. And so that creates what's called a white dwarf star. So you can have a blob of matter. They're about the size of the Earth, but they're about the mass of the sun. And so that's for smaller stars. They end up as these white dwarf things, which are very dense objects. There's another version, which is called a neutron star, which is the same thing, but for neutrons. And they move faster and faster. So if it's massive enough that it overwhelms the electron thing, then the electrons sort of crush into protons and turn into neutrons, and the whole thing starts again. And so a neutron star can be, you know, at least 1.5 times the mass of the sun, let's say, but it can be about 10 miles across. So that's an incredibly dense ball of matter held up by this. The neutrons moving around. It's got a
Bart, did
fancy
you
name.
want
It's
to
called
continue the
neutron degeneracy
conversation or
pressure,
not?
but that's what it is. But if you go even bigger, then even that can't hold it up. And as far as we know, then there's no known force that we know of that can hold the thing up if it's too massive. And so that's when it just almost winks out of existence, if you like. It collapses and collapses and collapses, and that's when you get a black hole.
We try to put that into perspective. The sun is 1,000,000 times bigger than the Earth.
Yeah.
And this neutron star is, would you say, 1.5 times the mass of the
Yeah,
sun,
so
but 10
they're-
miles wide?
Yeah. So, and there's loads of those around. They're called pulsars. So we see those all over the place. The first one that was discovered was called
Is he going to talk about
LGM-1,
Magnetar Star, I
because
wonder?
they spin very fast. And it was called LGM-1 because it's
They're
a very
scary.
regular pulse, and they thought it was little green men. So they
Oh,
called
wow.
it kind of jokingly Little Green Men 1. And so, yeah, we've seen that there's one called the Crab Pulsar, which is in the Crab Nebula, which we saw the supernova explosion. So that's when one of these stars explodes at the end of its life and then collapses to form a neutron star. And we saw that in 1054 AD.
Wasn't there some speculation that our our solar system at one point was a binary star system, and that one of those stars had become a dwarf?
I don't know.
Someone
heard
had read
that.
something about that in relationship to the dense object they believe is outside the Kuiper Belt.
Yeah, I mean, there's some evidence. There's a bit of evidence that there's something out there. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because of the periodic extinctions and things on Earth, like you get periodic bombardments from out in the Kuiper Belt. So yeah, I think one of the theories is
Periodic extinctions.
well, yeah. So for example, like there have been mass extinctions on Earth when a lot of the life died, and we don't know what caused all those, but sometimes they're impacts from space. That seems clear. And so yeah, there are theories that there's something orbiting out there which can disrupt all these objects out in the Kuiper Belt, that sends loads of comets and asteroids inwards to the inner solar system, and can cause havoc. And so there's some people look at those theories.
If I focus really hard, do my powers...
Look up a magnetar star, Bart. Look up that. That's terrifying. If that was a shootout, what was it?
No, go ahead.
It's a very terrifying thing to, and that's potentially could be one way that we could, no, that's it. We could be gone like that. Because if it was like a magnetar star, if it was like the light, if it was to
With
reach
every
us
new
fast,
discovery, the considerable
would-
odd physical phenomena
it would be
taking
so
place in the
instantaneous. It would be like a
noticed
millisecond.
today
We wouldn't
will
even
tell you about one of these
track it,
things.
predict
The
it.
most powerful
There will be no
magnets
stopping
in
it,
the
you know?
universe, with a staggeringly high level of radiation. Magnetars. Mankind has come across some extremely powerful radiation that reached us from deep space several times in the last 50 years. But as often is the case with space discoveries, the source was slow in being detected by astrophysicists. 1979. 3 US Vela satellites monitoring nuclear tests on the Earth detected an unusual gamma-ray flare. 1992, astrophysicists assumed that there was a celestial object out there not known to science with a huge electromagnetic radiation coefficient. 1998, a gamma-ray flare in the constellation Aquila. A number of measuring devices registered an unaccountable anomaly with its source located tens of thousands of light-years away from us. 2004, all telescopes in the world were for a short time dazzled. Less than a second later, every cubic centimeter in the solar system experienced a wave of gamma-ray radiation, the most massive burst in the entire history of observations. And today we're closer than ever to finally putting our finger on the nature of this discovery. A magnetar is a neutron star with an exceptionally powerful magnetic field of about 10 to the power of 13 Teslas, which in essence is trillions of times that of the electromagnetic radiation on the Earth. It is also one of the rarest and really most dangerous phenomena ever encountered by mankind. When a supermassive star is on the point of dying,
From African American, yeah, I think people would, but like in the beginning stages, people would have questions and not really feel certain about that, right?
So the recent ancestry doesn't matter. Thank
It does matter, bro.
I think it's the wrong way to think about it. Like when I say someone's an African American, it's a concept that's
maybe a couple hours. I don't see why
Maybe a
that
couple
detail
hours.
matters.
Okay. So I'm going to show you something that should cause you to question everything that you believe. about your crazy doctrines here, okay? And
Blasphemy.
and start to reconsider the passages that I've already provided and numerous, countless ones that I can provide, okay? That can't be true. Here's why. Deuteronomy 31:16. This is God.
Is there any knowledge in the world which is so certain that no reasonable man may doubt it? So begins Bertrand Russell's book, The Problems of Philosophy. In this video, we'll be discussing the conceptual ideas of this work and where it leaves us in our understanding of the universe and our relationship with it. To begin to look for certainty, it is natural to start with our immediate experiences, and it is fair to say that all knowledge must in some way be derived from our own experience. But to what extent can we rely on such experiences to bring us concrete knowledge of the world outside of our own minds? Let's take an example. In front of me I see a red chair. To touch it is cool and soft, and it is heavy, and when I push the chair I can hear it scraping along the floor. Anyone who sees or feels or hears the chair will agree with this description, so it may seem that no issues would arise. However, if we try to be even a little more precise, we very soon run into great difficulty. For example, when I first saw the chair I described it as red, a pretty uncontroversial statement, I think you'll agree. And although I believe the chair is actually the same colour of red all over, that is not how it actually appears to me when I look closely. There are parts that are reflecting light which appear much brighter to me, the brightest parts of the chair almost appearing white. Likewise, the parts of the chair covered by shadow appear much darker, almost black in some places. But these colours that I see on the chair are entirely fleeting. If there is any change whatsoever in the light falling on the chair, then the entire distribution of colours I see will change. We can also deduce from this that if there is more than one person in the room, no two people will see exactly the same distribution of colours on the chair, as no two people can be standing in exactly the same place, and any change in the point of view makes some change in how the light is reflected. Therefore, no two people will ever see the same chair, but also no one person will ever see the same chair twice at different times. Of all these colours I can see, which of them is actually the colour of the chair? We have no reason for regarding some of these as more really the colour of the chair than others. It follows that there is no colour which we can say is truly the colour of the chair. Describing our knowledge of the shape of the chair, we find similar problems. We are in the habit of judging what we consider to be the true shape of things automatically. So automatically, in fact, that we come to think we actually perceive the real shape of these physical objects. But just like the colour, the shape of the chair which we observe is different depending on the angle we are looking at it. Experience has taught us to construct the real shape from these apparent shapes, but the real shape is never actually what we see. It is only something inferred from what we see. And what we see is constantly changing shape as we move around. So here again, our senses seem not to give us the truth about the chair itself, but only about the appearance of the chair. To get this point across, we will look at one more example, the texture of the chair. To the naked eye it appears smooth and even, but were we to look at the chair under a microscope it would be quite a different story. The surface would appear to have tall mountains and deep valleys and all types of differences which we cannot perceive with the naked eye. Which of these is the real chair? We are tempted to say the version we see under the microscope, but this would be changed by a yet more powerful microscope. And if we can't trust what we see with the naked eye, why should we be able to trust what we see through a microscope? A different type of example will help to get the point across. When we see a tree on TV, we know we are not seeing the actual tree, but instead we are merely seeing a representation of the actual tree. We see the picture on the screen and infer that there is a real tree out there somewhere in the real world, and that a camera was pointed at the tree which recorded it, and so on until a picture of the tree appears on our TV screen. But when we are looking at the tree on TV, we are fully aware that we do not see the actual tree. Likewise, when we observe a tree in real life with our senses, we do not see the tree in itself, but we only see a representation of the tree, which may be caused by the tree, our eyes, the light hitting the tree, the signals in our brain, and a myriad of other factors. The tree in itself is only one of these, and it can never be viewed in isolation. When we see a tree, it throws an image into our consciousness. We, as subject, bring as much to the act of perception as the object itself. We have but a tenuous relation to the actual objects that cause our experiences. Thus, it becomes evident that the real chair, if indeed there is one, is not the same as what we actually come into contact with through any of our sensations. Our sensations cannot be supposed to reveal directly any definite property of the chair, but at most be signs of some property which perhaps causes all the sensations, but is not actually apparent in any of them. Thus, what we directly see and feel is merely appearance, which we believe to be a sign of some reality behind. But if the reality is not what appears, have we any means of knowing whether there is any reality at all? And if so, have we any means of finding out what it is actually like? In the next video in this series on appearance versus reality, we will look at Plato's allegory of the cave, a beautiful and timeless thought experiment illustrating the ways in which our senses are deceived and that they